The hum was the only god that mattered on Hephaestus Forge, a low, constant vibration that seeped through the triple reinforced steel deck plates and into the marrow of your bones. A ceaseless hymn of industry that was the first thing you heard when you woke and the last thing that followed you into the thin, restless sleep of zero-G life. For Kale, that hum was the metronome of his existence. Each pulse a reminder of his place in the grand, grinding machinery of the United Stellar Republic. He was a remnant, a walking, breathing echo of a war nobody wanted to remember, his blood thick with the legacy of the Titan Project. He and his kind weren't the 20-foot-tall behemoths of legend. The monsters whispered about in history vids meant to scare children and glorify the past. They were the diluted dregs. The 4th and 5th generation descendants bred down but never bred out, still towering a head and a half over baseline humans, with shoulders too wide for standard corridors and hands that could crush Durasteel pipe like a soda can. They were humanity's shame and its most durable tool, relegated to the deep, hot, and dangerous work that the smaller, smarter, and more respected norms wouldn't touch. Kale's world was the Forge's gut, a labyrinth of plasma conduits and fusion furnaces in Sector Gamma 9, where the recycled star stuff of dead nebulas was smelted into the bones of new warships. He spent his 10-hour shifts hauling coolant regulators the size of coffins, his muscles dense and roped from a lifetime of labor, straining against the magnetic grapples that were supposed to make the work easy for a norm. For him and the other dozen remnants in his crew, Jorik, with a face like a cratered moon, Lena, whose quiet intensity could stare down a reactor breach, old Valerius, who claimed to remember stories from his grandfather about the real Titans. This was life, a cycle of sweat, ration packs, and the shared, unspoken understanding that they were living ghosts. The norms kept their distance, their polite smiles never quite reaching their eyes. A mix of fear and disgust flickering there whenever they had to interface with the big men from the lower decks. They called them ogres, brutes, throwbacks, always just out of earshot but loud enough in their actions, in the way they'd flatten themselves against a bulkhead to let a remnant pass, in the separate, shabbier mess hall they were assigned to, in the way Republic Navy patrols always seemed to double up whenever they walked through the public sectors. The war with the silicates was a distant abstraction here, a stream of sanitized news feeds that flickered on the mess hall screens, showing sleek Republic cruisers firing brilliant lances of energy at crystalline alien ships that glittered like shattered obsidian in the void. It was a clean war, the feed suggested, a war of tactics and technology, something that happened far away from the grease and heat of the Forge. The silicates were a geological anomaly, a species of sentient crystal that communicated in resonant frequencies and expanded its territory by converting matter rock, metal, flesh into more of its own kind. They were patient, methodical, and utterly alien, and for 50 years the Republic had held them at a stalemate along the Perseus Arm, a conflict so cold it had practically frozen into the background radiation of the galaxy. But the hum of Hephaestus Forge was changing. It had been for weeks, a subtle shift in pitch, a new dissonance that crawled under the dominant thrum like a sickness. The lights on the lower decks had started flickering. Maintenance droids were malfunctioning at a record pace, and a strange, faint geometric pattern, like frost, had been spotted on the outer hull near the refinery intakes, dismissed by the norm engineers as simple plasma scarring. Kale felt it in his teeth, a high-frequency whine that nobody else seemed to notice, or at least, nobody else would admit to. He was securing a new power conduit, the massive wrench in his hands feeling like a toy, when the primary hum died. It wasn't a gradual power down. It was a sudden, violent cessation, like a heart stopping mid-beat. The silence that rushed in was deafening, a physical pressure that made his ears pop. Emergency lights bathed the corridor in a blood-red glare, and the magnetic gravity generators sputtered, their pull weakening for a terrifying second before stabilizing at a fraction of their normal strength. A voice, clipped and panicked, crackled over the station-wide comm. "All hands, this is Control. We have a cascading system failure originating from the primary refining matrix. Hull integrity is unstable. Stand by for..." The voice cut out, replaced by a sound that would haunt Kyle forever. A noise like a billion shards of glass grinding together. A harmonic screech that vibrated not in the air, but directly in the mind. Kyle dropped the wrench, the clang echoing in the sudden stillness, and looked at Yorick, whose wide eyes reflected the pulsing red alarms. "What in the hell was that?" Yorick breathed, his deep voice trembling slightly. Before Kyle could answer, the deck beneath them shuddered violently. A seam on the bulkhead 10 yards away split open with a scream of tortured metal, not from an explosion, but as if it were being pushed apart from the inside. From the tear, a shimmering, crystalline growth began to emerge, branching out like a time-lapse video of a snowflake forming, each new facet catching the red emergency lights and fracturing them into 1,000 razor-sharp points of color. It was beautiful and horrifying, a living jewel that grew with an unnatural speed, crawling across the walls and floor. One of the Norm technicians who had been overseeing their work, a man named Corliss who always made a point of looking past them instead of at them, screamed. He had been standing near the rupture, and the crystal lattice was already creeping up his leg, his containment suit dissolving as the shimmering structure touched it. It wasn't burning him, it was consuming him, converting him. His flesh and bone transformed, turning translucent, his terrified face becoming a frozen mask of agate and quartz. His scream became a part of the awful, grinding harmony as his entire body was subsumed into the growing crystalline mass. Panic erupted. The other Norms in the sector scrambled, running for the nearest blast door, their mag boots slipping on the deck plates that were now slick with a fine, sparkling dust shed by the growth. Kyle stood frozen for a second, his mind struggling to process the impossible sight. The distant war suddenly made real and intimate in the most grotesque way imaginable. This wasn't a ship-to-ship battle. This was an infection. The station wasn't being attacked. It was being eaten. "Move!" Lena's sharp voice cut through his shock. "The aft pressure door." Now, she was already hurting the other remnants, her usual calm replaced by a cold, focused urgency. The crystal was spreading faster now, a wave of alien geometry that flowed over machinery, absorbing it, repurposing it. A maintenance droid was caught in its path, and its metal chassis was twisted into a new, unrecognizable form, a spiny crystalline sculpture that pulsed with a faint inner light. As Kale turned to run, he saw one of the Norms go down, his leg snagged by a newly sprouted crystal spur. Kyle hesitated, the ingrained Republic propaganda about civilian assistance flashing through his mind, but Yorick grabbed his arm, his grip like iron. "He's gone. Kyle, we can't help him." Yorick was right. The man was already being encased, his muffled cries fading into the relentless grinding sound. They ran, their heavy strides shaking the deck, their size a disadvantage in the narrow, cluttered maintenance corridors. Behind them, the grinding harmony grew louder, closer. They reached the aft pressure door, a thick slab of titanium alloy designed to hold back the vacuum of space. Valerius was already at the control panel, his thick fingers fumbling with the delicate keypad. "It's dead," he yelled over the rising cacophony. "The whole network is down." The crystal was flowing down the corridor toward them now, a river of impossible physics, the air growing thick with its resonant shriek. "Then we go through it," Kael said, the words coming out in a low growl that surprised even himself. He looked at the door, then at the emergency release wheel, a manual override system designed to be turned by 4 norms in unison. He grabbed the thick spokes of the wheel, his knuckles white, and pulled. Yorick and Lena joined him without a word, their combined strength falling into an old rhythm born of years of shared labor. The metal groaned in protest, the gears inside screaming as they were forced to move against a dead system. Kael roared, a raw, primal sound of exertion and fury, and with a final, shuddering crack, the locking bolts retracted. The door slid open a few feet, just enough to slip through, revealing the unlit, silent corridor beyond. They scrambled through the gap, one by one, with Valerius going last. As he was halfway through, a razor-sharp shard of crystal shot from the advancing mass, fast as a bullet, and buried itself in his calf. He cried out, stumbling, and Kael and Yorick grabbed him, hauling him the rest of the way through the opening before Kael slammed his palm against the emergency close button on the other side. The door slid shut, the grinding shriek muffled but not gone. They were in a secondary access tunnel, the darkness absolute save for the faint green glow of Valerius's blood. Kael fumbled for his work lamp, its beam cutting a shaky cone through the blackness. Valerius was on the ground, his face pale with shock, tearing at his leg. The crystal shard embedded in his flesh was pulsing with a soft, internal light, and a fine, web-like pattern was spreading out from the wound across his skin. He was being converted. "Get it out," Valerius rasped, his voice tight with pain and terror. "Before it takes me." Lena knelt beside him, her face grim. "It's too deep. It's already in his bloodstream." Yorick looked away, his jaw tight. They all knew what was happening. They had just seen it with Corliss. Valerius looked up at Kael, his old eyes pleading. "Don't let me become that, please. You know what they say about us, about the old blood. Don't let me be a monster's toy." Kael's throat was tight. He looked at the wound. The crystalline growth was slow, far slower than it had been with the norm. On Corliss, the conversion had taken seconds. On Valerius, it was a creeping sickness, fighting for every inch. It was as if his body, his very cells were resisting. The Titan blood, the genetic markers that made them bigger, stronger, more durable. It was fighting the silicate plague. A cold realization washed over Kael. The engineers, the soldiers, the norms, they were all vulnerable, kindling for the crystal fire. But the remnants, the outcasts, the freaks, they could resist. They might not be immune, but they could fight it on a biological level. Their cursed blood was suddenly the only thing in the universe that mattered. Valerius let out a choked sob. "Kael, please." Kael made a decision. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. He was a piece of industrial equipment, a forgotten relic. But Valerius was one of his own. He knelt down, pulling a heavy-duty plasma cutter from his belt. It was a tool, not a weapon, designed for slicing through derelict ship hulls. He powered it on, the hiss of the focusing arc filling the silence. "Hold him," Kael said to Yorick, his voice hard as iron. He looked Valerius in the eye. "This is going to hurt." Valerius nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. Better to lose a leg than my soul. Kyle took a deep breath, the acrid smell of ozone filling his nostrils, and brought the searing blue point of the plasma cutter down. He didn't know if they would survive, or if there was even a station left to survive in. He only knew that the war wasn't distant anymore. It was inside this station, inside his friend, and for the first time in his life, being a remnant wasn't a curse. It was a weapon. The forge was no longer a workplace. It was a battlefield, and they, the forgotten monsters, were the only soldiers left. The stench of seared flesh and ozone was a thick, gagging cloud in the narrow tunnel, a smell so primal it bypassed thought and went straight to the gut. Kyle's hands didn't shake as he pressed the white-hot edge of the plasma cutter's housing against the ragged stump of Valerius's leg, but a tremor ran through the thick muscles of his back, a cold fire of adrenaline and horror. Valerius didn't scream. A long, guttural hiss escaped his clenched teeth, his whole body rigid with an agony Kale couldn't begin to imagine. His knuckles were bone white where he gripped Jorik's arm, his old face a mask of sweat and grime, but his eyes, when they met Kale's, were clear. They held a terrifying gratitude. The hiss of cooking flesh finally subsided, leaving behind a blackened, cauterized seal where the crystalline infection had been moments before. Kyle powered down the cutter, the sudden silence in the tunnel almost as loud as the tool's scream. He felt a wave of nausea, the weight of his action settling in his stomach like a block of lead. He had just mutilated one of his own, a man he respected, a man who had taught him how to recalibrate a fusion injector when he was just a clumsy kid. Auric gently lowered Valerius back against the bulkhead, his own face ashen. Lena was already ripping strips from the liner of her work tunic, her movements economical and precise as she began to wrap the gruesome wound. "It worked," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else, her fingers probing the edges of the cauterized flesh. The spread is stopped. Completely inert, the abandoned crystal shard lay on the deck plate a few feet away, no longer pulsing. Its inner light faded to a dull, milky white. It was just a rock now, severed from its source. Valerius's breathing was shallow, ragged. The blood. "It fights," he rasped, his voice thin. "Slows it down. Gives a chance." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Good to know." They sat there for a long moment in the oppressive darkness, the only light coming from Kyle's work lamp, which cast long, dancing shadows that made the confined space feel like a tomb. The muffled, grinding harmony of the silicate conversion was a constant, unsettling presence, a reminder that their small pocket of survival was temporary. They had a choice, and they had a chance, but they were still trapped in a dying station. "We can't stay here," Yorick said, his voice a low rumble of barely controlled fear. "That thing will find a way through. It'll eat through the damn door if it has to." He was right. The silicates were methodical. They would not leave a pocket of unconverted matter undisturbed for long. "Escape pods are on the upper decks," Lena said, her voice cutting through the fear with cold logic as she secured the makeshift bandage around Valerius's leg. "In the norm sectors. We'd never make it. Those corridors will be the first to fall." She looked up, her gaze sweeping over Kyle, then Jorik. "Where is the largest concentration of our people on this station?" Kyle didn't have to think. "Omega 12, the primary ore processing bay. At least 50 of us on this shift. Maybe more." It was the heart of the forge's brute force labor, a cavernous section deep in the station's industrial spine where raw asteroid ore was cracked and sorted, A job considered too dangerous and dusty for norms. That's our best chance. Lena continued, her tone solidifying her idea into a plan. More of us means a better chance of fighting, a better chance of surviving. We have to get there. Not up, through the norm decks. Down, through the guts of this place. She pointed a grimy finger down the unlit maintenance tunnel. We use the service conduits, the old transfer shafts, the places they don't go. We know these tunnels better than any engineer in control. Kyle looked at Valerius, who was drifting into shock, his breathing still worryingly shallow. He can't walk. We'll have to carry him. Yorick squared his massive shoulders. Then we carry him. I'll take first watch. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. There was no other choice. Kyle nodded, a new and terrible weight settling on him. He hadn't asked to lead, but the cutter in his hand, ready, the decision he'd made, had placed him there. All right, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his soul. We move. Yorick, you and I will rig a sling for Valerius. Lena, you take point. You've got the best eyes. We stick to the spine tunnels. Avoid the main arteries. We move quiet, and we move fast. They worked with the grim efficiency of people who had spent their lives solving practical problems with their hands. They tore more strips from their tunics and wove them into a crude but strong sling, hoisting Valerius between Coil and Yorick. The old man was a deadweight now, barely conscious, his head lolling against Yorick's shoulder, with Lena leading the way, her work lamp cutting a narrow path through the inky blackness. They set off into the station's hidden depths. The journey was a descent into a mechanical hell. The tunnels were a maze, unlit, unmapped on any public schematic, and suffocatingly tight, even for norms. For them, it was a constant struggle, their wide shoulders scraping against rust-caked pipes, their heads ducking under massive, inert ventilation fans. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old lubricants and cold metal, but it was the sounds that wore on the nerves. The station was no longer silent. The pervasive, grinding hum was their constant companion. But now there were other noises, the distant shriek of twisting steel, the faint, rhythmic clicking from down unexplored corridors, and a soft but melodic chiming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. After what felt like hours, they found a ladder leading down to a wider sublevel, a primary power conduit junction. The space was larger, a cavern of thick, bundled cables and humming transformers. And it was here they saw the full extent of the station's transformation. The crystal wasn't just growing, it was engineering. It had woven itself through the power cables, creating intricate, lattice-like structures that pulsed with a soft, ethereal blue light, drawing energy directly from the station's fusion-powered grid. The air thrummed with stolen power, and the melodic chiming was louder here, resonating from the crystalline growths themselves. It's beautiful, Yorick breathed, his voice full of a horrified awe. He was right. The chamber looked like a cathedral built by a mad god of geometry. The cold, functional machinery of the station remade into something alien and organic. But the beauty was a lie. In the center of the chamber, standing motionless, were three figures. They were norms, 2 engineers and a security guard, their forms perfectly preserved. But their bodies were no longer made of flesh. They were encased in a semi-translucent crystal, the same shimmering material that had taken Corliss. Their Republic uniforms and even the expressions of terror on their faces frozen within the crystalline matrix. They were statues, monuments to the station's last moments of humanity. Lena held up a hand and signaling a halt. "Don't get closer." As if in response to her words, the figures stirred. Their movements were not human. They were stiff, jerky, like marionettes pulled by unseen strings. Their heads swiveled in unison, their crystalline eyes, which had no pupils, fixing on the remnants huddled in the shadows. The melodic chiming intensified, and Kyle realized with a jolt of pure terror that it was coming from them. They were the source. They weren't statues. They were guards. Or worse, puppets. "Chimes," Kyle whispered, the name coming to him unbidden. He hefted the plasma cutter in his hand, its weight a cold comfort. It was a tool, but it was all he had. The security guard Chime took a step forward, its mag boots clicking on the deck with an unnatural precision. It raised its arm, and the standard issue pulse rifle it held had been altered. Its barrel fused with a long, jagged crystal that glowed with the same blue energy as the conduits. It wasn't going to fire a plasma bolt. It was going to fire something far worse. "Scatter!" Kale roared, shoving Yorick and the unconscious Valerius toward the cover of a massive transformer. The air split with a high-pitched shriek as the chime fired. A bolt of pure resonant energy, a focused wave of the grinding harmony, slammed into the bulkhead where they had been standing. The metal didn't melt or explode. It dissolved, unraveling into a cloud of sparkling dust as a crystalline cancer erupted from the point of impact. Lena was already moving, darting to the side, grabbing a heavy-duty wrench from a nearby tool locker. Yorick, after laying Valerius down gently, ripped a meter-long section of steel conduit from its brackets on the wall, wielding it like a club. Kale didn't hesitate. He charged. He knew their only advantage was their strength and the close confines of the junction. He barreled toward the nearest chime, one of the engineers, which was raising its hands as if to project a wave of the same crystalline energy. Kyle slammed into it with the force of a freight hauler. The impact would have shattered a normal human's bones. The chime barely budged, its crystalline body impossibly dense, but the collision threw it off balance. Kyle brought the plasma cutter around in a brutal arc, striking the creature's head. There was no blood, no flesh, just a high-pitched, ringing sound as the superheated tool carved a deep, glowing groove into the crystal. The chime staggered back, its internal light flickering, but it wasn't down. It swung a crystallized arm, its fingers elongated into sharp talons, catching Kael across the ribs. The blow was like being hit with a sledgehammer, and the talons sliced through his tunic and skin, leaving 4 deep, burning gouges. Pain exploded in his chest, but it was a clean pain, a familiar pain. Nothing spread from the wound. His blood was still his own. On the other side of the room, Yorick was in a brutal slugging match with the other engineer chime, his steel pipe clanging against its hardened body. The chime was relentless, its movements inhumanly fast, but Yorick's raw fury was a match for it. He roared with every swing, each blow sending spiderweb cracks across the chime's surface. Lena was a whirlwind of motion, her smaller size making her a harder target for the rifle-wielding guard. She ducked under another energy blast and slammed the heavy wrench into the chime's knee joint. The crystal shattered with a sound like breaking glass, and the creature fell to one knee, its aim thrown off. Kael ignored the fire in his side and focused. He couldn't outlast this thing. He had to break it. He saw the faint outline of the Norm's heart, suspended within the translucent chest cavity, now a pulsing, crystalline node. That had to be the core. He dodged another clumsy swipe, powered up the cutter to maximum, and thrust it forward like a sword. He plunged the searing blade deep into the chime's chest, aiming for that central node. The creature stiffened, and the chiming sound it emitted rose in pitch to an unbearable shriek. The internal blue light flared violently, and then, with a deafening crack, the chime exploded, showering the chamber in a hail of razor-sharp fragments. Kale threw his arm up to shield his face, the tiny shards peppering his skin like needles. He turned just in time to see Lena bring her wrench down on the back of the kneeling guard's neck, shattering its connection to its torso. It collapsed into a pile of crystalline rubble. Yorick gave one final, bellowing roar and brought his bent and battered pipe down on his opponent's head, smashing it into 1,000 glittering pieces. The room fell silent. The melodic chiming was gone, replaced by the sound of their own ragged, desperate breaths. Yorick stood over the remains of his chime, his chest heaving, his face a mask of sweat and rage. Lena leaned against the tool locker, the heavy wrench hanging limply in her hand. Kyle staggered back, pressing a hand to the deep cuts in his side. They had won, but the cost was clear. They were bleeding, exhausted, and they had just confirmed that the station's dead were now their enemies. As the adrenaline began to fade, Lena walked over to the now inert crystal conduits. She placed a hand near one of the complex lattices, her brow furrowed in concentration. "They're drawing power," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The crystal, the chimes, all of it is networked to the station's main grid. That's how it's spreading so fast. It's following the energy." She looked at Kyle, her eyes sharp and intelligent. And the chimes were guarding this junction. They weren't just standing here. They were protecting their power source. A new, terrible understanding dawned on Kyle. The station wasn't just a buffet. It was a weapon being reforged. The silicates were turning Hephaestus Forge itself against them. But Lena's discovery was also a key. "So if we follow the dead conduits," Kyle said, thinking aloud, "the ones that have been shut down for maintenance, we can avoid them." Lena nodded. "It's a path, a dangerous one, but it's the only one we have." Kyle looked at the schematic display on a nearby, miraculously intact panel. He traced a route with his bloody finger, a winding, dark path through decommissioned sectors and forgotten shafts, a path of silence and shadow that led, eventually, to the deep, dark heart of the station where their people were. It was a ghost's road, a path through the station's dead veins, and it was their only hope. The silence left behind was a wound in the air, throbbing with the ghost echoes of their fight. Kyle pressed a torn strip of his tunic against the gouges in his side, the fabric quickly soaking through with a warm, wet stickiness. Each breath was a fresh spark of pain, but it was a grounding pain, a reminder that he was still made of flesh and blood, not crystal and resonant light. Yorick leaned against the transformer, his makeshift club a mangled piece of scrap in his hand, his knuckles bleeding. Lena, ever practical, was already scavenging, her work lamp beam cutting decisively through the gloom as she examined the remains of the chimes. "Their internal structure is a fractal," she said, her voice a low, intense whisper. She nudged a shard with the toe of her boot. "It's not just a conversion, it's a complete re-engineering of matter at the molecular level. This isn't a plague. It's an invasion force that builds its armies from its victims." Her words hung in the dead air, adding a layer of intellectual horror to the visceral fear they already felt. They weren't just being killed, they were being repurposed. "Can we move?" Kale grunted, pushing himself upright. Every muscle protested. He looked at Valerius, who remained mercifully unconscious, his life a fragile, flickering light in their care. Jorik nodded, his face grim. "We have to." He gestured with his head toward the silent, dark tunnel that represented their planned route. "Let's get into the boneyard." They refastened the sling, Horik and Kale once again taking the old man's weight. The transfer of mass was a clumsy, agonizing process that sent fresh waves of fire through Kale's side. They left the Chamber of Light and puppets behind, plunging back into the absolute darkness of the station's decommissioned arteries. It was a descent into a graveyard of forgotten engineering, a world of silent, cold machinery that hadn't felt the touch of a maintenance worker in decades. The air grew colder, the metallic tang of decay thick in their nostrils. Their only guide was the narrow, bouncing beam of Lena's lamp and the faint, glowing schematics on the maintenance panel she had memorized. The path was a brutal obstacle course. They navigated around collapsed sections of tunnel, the buckled deck plates groaning under their weight. They climbed through massive, silent ventilation ducts, their insides coated with a thick, greasy dust that choked their lungs and made every surface treacherous. At one point, they had to cross a zero-G cargo shaft, the station's artificial gravity plates long dead here. They moved with a clumsy slowness, using magnetic handholds to pull themselves and their precious cargo across a black chasm that fell away into the station's unlit core. All the while, the muffled, distant hum of the active, converted station was their companion, a low thrum that vibrated through the steel like the heartbeat of the monster that was consuming their world. After what could have been hours or days, Lena called a halt. They had reached a sealed-off sector, a series of old fabrication workshops that had been abandoned after a catastrophic accident a generation ago. The massive blast door was sealed, but its manual release mechanism, rusted and stiff, was no match for their combined remnant strength. With a prolonged, agonized screech of metal, they forced it open enough to squeeze through, sealing it behind them. The workshops were a time capsule. Half-finished machine parts lay on workbenches, covered in a thick blanket of dust. The ghostly outlines of tools were visible on the walls where they had once hung. The air was stale and dead, but crucially, it was silent. The ever-present hum of the silicate conversion couldn't penetrate these deep, forgotten chambers. It was the first true silence they had experienced since the hum had died, and it was both a relief and a profound source of unease. They laid Valerius down in a relatively clear space. He was feverish, muttering names Kale didn't recognize in a shallow, restless sleep. Lena found a sealed medical kit on the wall, its contents years expired but better than nothing. As she cleaned and properly dressed Valerius's stump, Kale stripped off the tattered remains of his tunic to tend to the gashes in his side. The cuts were deep, angry red lines against his pale skin. But like Valerius's wound after the amputation, there was no sign of conversion. Just clean, mortal injury. Yorick paced the length of the workshop like a caged bear, his massive fists clenching and unclenching. "Why us?" "Kyle," he finally burst out, his voice raw and echoing in the vast, dead space. "We spend our lives in the dark, doing the work they won't. They call us throwbacks, ogres. And when the end of the world comes, we're the only ones with a damn chance of fighting it. What kind of cosmic joke is that?" "The kind that keeps us alive," Lena answered without looking up from her work. "They're soft. Their civilization has made them that way. We're not. That's not a joke. It's an advantage." "Some advantage," Jorik growled, kicking at a pile of discarded metal shavings. "He's right, though," Kale said, wincing as he applied a disinfectant swab to one of his cuts. "It's always been this way for our kind." He looked over at Valerius. The old man's eyes were open. just slits, but they were lucid. They called the first ones monsters too, Valerius whispered, his voice a dry rustle of sound. They all fell silent, leaning in to hear him. My grandfather told me. Built them to fight a war the norms were losing. Made them big, strong, full of rage. Then they tried to bury them when it was over. Told the galaxy they were a genetic mistake, a shameful past. He took a ragged breath. But you can't bury strength. It always finds a way out. When it's needed. His eyes slid shut again, his brief moment of clarity spent. A heavy silence descended on the workshop. Valerius's words weren't just history, they were a prophecy. A mantle being settled onto their unwilling shoulders. They were the children of monsters, born to fight a war their creators had forgotten how to wage. It was during this lull that Lena, ever vigilant, noticed it. Her head tilted, her gaze fixed on the far, darkened end of the workshop. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Kael and Jorik froze, straining their ears. There was nothing, only the faint drip of condensation from a pipe somewhere. Hear what Jorik asked. A skittering sound, like metal on metal. But light. Kael grabbed his plasma cutter, the familiar weight a comfort. He swept the beam of his lamp across the far wall, illuminating stacks of old containers and derelict machinery. Nothing. Probably just the station settling, he said, though his own senses were on high alert. No, Lena insisted, her voice dropping lower. It wasn't a settling sound. It was deliberate. They waited in breathless silence for a full minute. Nothing. Kael was about to dismiss it when he saw it. In the shadows between two large cargo containers, a patch of darkness seemed to detach itself from the rest, to move with a liquid, boneless grace. It was low to the ground, and as it scuttled into a thin sliver of light from his lamp, he caught a glimpse of a sleek, multi-limbed form. It wasn't crystalline like the chimes. It was matte black, made of some kind of chitinous, non-reflective material, and it moved with the terrifying speed of an insect. It was a hunter. Before he could shout a warning, it leaped. It was impossibly fast, a black blur that shot across the 50 feet separating them in an instant. It wasn't aiming for Kael or the heavily armed Jorik. It was going for the weakest target. It was going for Valerius. Jorik roared and moved to intercept it, but the creature was too quick. It landed silently on Valerius's chest, its 6 slender, razor-tipped legs digging into his flesh. A long, segmented tail whipped around, and at its tip was a shimmering, crystalline stinger, identical to the shard that had infected Valerius's leg. Kael didn't think. He lunged, firing the plasma cutter. The beam of searing energy sliced through the air where the creature had been a microsecond before. It had already sprung back, landing nimbly on a nearby workbench, its featureless head cocked as if observing them. It let out a soft, clicking hiss, and in the darkness behind it, Kael saw 2 more pairs of faintly glowing, multifaceted eyes light up. They weren't alone. It's adapting. Lena breathed, her face a mask of horrified realization. The crystal. It's not just a plague. It's an intelligence. It learned its networked chimes were vulnerable in the powered sectors. It's sending scouts into the dark. The darkness was no longer their sanctuary. It was a hunting ground. The first stalker hissed again and leaped, not at them, but onto the ceiling, where it clung like a spider, its black form almost invisible against the dark metal. The other 2 emerged from the shadows, flanking them. They were smaller, sleeker, and infinitely more predatory than the lumbering chimes. They were built for stealth and speed. Back to back, Kale yelled, shoving Lena behind him as he and Yorick formed a small triangle of defense around Valerius. "Don't let them get behind you." Yorick swung his mangled pipe in a wide, desperate arc as one of the stalkers darted in, its stinger flashing. The pipe connected with a sickening crunch, sending the creature skidding across the floor. Its chitinous shell cracked, but the other one used the opening, scurrying past Yorick and lunging at Kael's legs. Kael stumbled back, kicking out with a heavy mag boot, catching the creature in its midsection and sending it flying into a stack of old barrels. The one on the ceiling chose that moment to drop. It fell silently, aiming its stinger right for the bat of Kael's neck. "Kael, above you!" Lena screamed. Kael threw himself to the side, rolling as the creature landed where he had been standing, its stinger burying itself deep in the steel deck plate with a sharp thwack. Before it could retract the stinger, Yorick was on it, bringing his foot down with all his weight, crushing its head with a wet, cracking sound. They stood panting in the wreckage of their brief sanctuary, two stalkers twitching on the floor, the third having vanished back into the shadows. The immediate threat was gone, but the illusion of safety was shattered forever. Valerius was gasping, his face contorted in pain, 4 new puncture wounds bleeding freely on his chest, while rushed to his side, his heart sinking as he saw the faint, web-like patterns already spreading from the new wounds. The infection was back. They had survived, or they were wounded, exposed, being actively hunted by creatures perfectly adapted to the dark. Silent paths they had chosen. Their one strategic advantage had been turned against them. Kael looked from Valerius's pale, sweating face to the deep, waiting darkness of the tunnel ahead. The darkness wasn't empty anymore. It was watching, and they had to go right back into it. Desperation is a cold, sharp-edged tool. It strips away hesitation, pares away fear, and leaves only the raw, brutal calculus of survival. Kael looked at the spreading crystalline frost on Valerius's chest, a delicate, lethal lacework creeping from the 4 fresh puncture wounds, and felt that cold edge press against his soul. There was no time for deliberation, no room for despair. "Hold him down," Kael said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He was already powering up the plasma cutter, the familiar hiss a grim counterpoint to Valerius's shallow, ragged breathing. Yorick's face was a ruin of conflict. Again, Kael, his chest. We can't just keep cutting pieces off him. He won't survive it. He won't survive this." Kael shot back, gesturing with the glowing tip of the cutter toward the advancing infection. The crystal was moving faster this time, as if the initial dose had primed his system for a more rapid conversion. The Titan blood was still fighting, but it was a losing battle. He asked us not to let him become one of them. Are you going to break that promise? Lena was already there, her face set in a grim mask of necessity. She tore open Valerius's tunic, exposing his chest. "Here," she said, her voice clinical and precise, pointing to a spot just below his sternum where the 4 separate infections were beginning to converge. "If you can excise the central point before the lattice connects to his heart and lungs, you might stop it, but you'll have to be fast." There was no more argument. Yorick pinned Valerius's shoulders with a gentleness that belied his immense strength. The old man was barely conscious, his eyes fluttering, a low moan escaping his lips. Kael took a deep, steadying breath, the acrid smell of ozone flooding his senses, and brought the cutter down. He didn't carve this time. He used the focus point of the plasma arc like a surgical tool, searing a deep, circular trough into the flesh around the converging infection. isolating it. The stench was 10 times worse than before, thick and cloying. He worked with a speed and precision he didn't know he possessed, his entire world narrowing to the searing blue point and the creeping crystalline enemy. With a final, sickening scoop, he lifted the infected section of flesh and muscle away, a puck of dying tissue and dying crystal, and flung it into the darkness. He immediately pressed the flat of the cutter's blade against the raw, gaping wound, cauterizing it in a long, agonizing hiss. Valerius's body convulsed, a single, sharp cry torn from his throat, and then he went limp, his head lolling to the side. For a terrifying moment, Kyle thought he was dead. Lena pressed 2 fingers to the old man's neck. "He's alive," she breathed, her voice shaky for the first time. "His pulse is a thread, but he's alive." They were battered, bleeding, and now their charge was clinging to life by the thinnest of margins. The silence of the workshop no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a tomb, waiting for its next occupant. The third stalker was still out there, a silent predator that had likely already reported their position, not with radio waves, but with some resonant frequency that pulsed through the station's stolen structure. "We move now," Kyle said, his voice a rasp. "We don't wait for its friends to show up." He looked at the long, dark tunnel leading out of the workshop. "Lena, the path to Omega-12. How much further?" Lena closed her eyes for a moment, accessing the mental map she had built. "Another 3 sectors, but the next one is a problem. Sector Epsilon 4, the old Cryo storage facility. It's the only way through, but the schematics show it was powered by an independent geothermal backup grid. It might not be dark." An independent power source. It was a terrifying thought. If the main grid was the Silicates highway system, an independent grid was an island fortress they would have already conquered and fortified. Going in there could be suicide. "Is there another way?" Jorik asked, already lifting Valerius's frail form into his arms, deciding that the sling was too slow, too cumbersome. Lena shook her head. "The other conduits are collapsed. This is the only route that connects to the lower processing levels. It's Epsilon 4 or we're trapped here. Then that's where we go," Kyle said, his decision absolute. He would rather face 100 chimes in the light than be hunted by one more stalker in the dark. Their progress was slower now. Jorik burdened by the full weight of Valerius, who was a dead weight in his arms. Kale took the point, plasma cutter held at the ready, its humming arc casting a flickering, aggressive light into the oppressive blackness. The silence of the tunnels had changed. It was no longer empty. Every shadow seemed to hold a skittering, chitinous form. Every faint drip of water sounded like the click of a clawed leg on steel. Fear was a living thing, walking beside them, breathing its cold breath on their necks. They found the entrance to Epsilon 4 a massive, circular pressure door with a faded biohazard symbol stenciled on it. A thick layer of dust coated everything, but underneath, Kyle could feel a faint vibration in the deck. The geothermal grid was active. Lena found the manual override panel, its screen dark and dead. "No power from the main grid," she confirmed. "But it's warm. It's definitely active inside." Kyle didn't hesitate. He jammed the tip of the plasma cutter into the seam of the door near the locking mechanism and began to carve. Molten metal dripped to the floor, hardening into small, metallic tears. It took 10 agonizingly loud minutes, every second of which he expected a stalker to come screaming out of the darkness behind them. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, he cut the lock free. Jorik put his shoulder to the door and shoved. It swung inward into a space that was not dark. Epsilon 4 was bathed in a cold, sterile blue-white light from emergency strips running along the ceiling. It was a vast, cavernous chamber, lined with rows upon rows of cryopods, stacked 10 high and stretching back into the gloom like a futuristic mausoleum. The air was frigid, smelling of ozone and coolant, and it was utterly silent. There were no chimes, no crystal growths, no sign of the silicate plague at all. The place was pristine, untouched. "Something's wrong," Jorik muttered, his voice a low growl. "It's too clean." Kale felt it too. It was the silence of a baited trap. They moved cautiously into the chamber, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the vast space. The cryopods were all dark, their status screens blank. The facility had been decommissioned for years, and its occupants, mostly long-haul ship crews and colonists in transit, relocated or written off. "This grid is isolated," Lena whispered, running a hand along a humming power conduit. "Completely cut off from the rest of the station. The crystal couldn't smell the power. It couldn't follow it here." It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The stalkers had found them in the dark, dead sectors. An intelligent, adapting enemy wouldn't leave an active power source untapped for long. It would have sent something to investigate. As they moved deeper into the cryo bay, Kyle noticed something. One of the cryopods, halfway down a row, was not dark. Its status screen was active, glowing with a soft, green light. The readout was a single word: awakening. "Get down," Kale hissed, shoving Lena and Jorik behind a row of pods. He peered cautiously around the edge. The pod's transparent faceplate was frosting over from the inside, obscuring whatever was in it. But as he watched, a hand, impossibly large and pale, slammed against the inside of the faceplate, cracking the cryoglass. It wasn't a Norm's hand. It was the hand of a remnant. A second hand joined the first, and with a screech of tearing metal and shattering glass, the front of the pod was ripped away. A figure stumbled out, collapsing to the floor in a cloud of freezing vapor. It was massive, even bigger than Jorik, its body a corded mass of muscle that seemed too dense for its frame. It wore the tattered remains of an old Republic military uniform, a design Kale had only seen in history vids. Its head was shaved, and a series of metallic ports were embedded in its skull. Just above the temple, the figure pushed itself up to its knees, shaking its head as if to clear a fog that was centuries deep. Its eyes, when they opened, were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held a look of profound, animalistic confusion. Then those eyes found Kale, Lena, and Jorik, huddled behind the pods. The confusion vanished, replaced by a flash of something else pure, unadulterated aggression. The figure let out a roar, a sound that was not entirely human, a guttural bellow of rage and pain that shook the very air in the chamber. It launched itself at them, its movements clumsy from cryosickness but terrifyingly powerful. "It's one of the firsts," Lena gasped, her face pale with shock. "A true titan. They must have stored some of them here." They had stumbled from one nightmare into another. The cryo bay wasn't a sanctuary. It was a prison. And they had just walked in during a jailbreak. Jorik shoved Valerius into Lena's arms. "Get him out of here," he yelled, grabbing his battered steel pipe. He met the Titan's charge with a wild swing. The pipe, which had shattered a chime's head, bent in half as the Titan caught it, its massive hand absorbing the blow without even flinching. The Titan twisted, ripping the pipe from Jorik's grasp and hurling him across the aisle like a child's toy. Jorik slammed into a bank of cryopods and slumped to the ground. Stunned, Kael fired the plasma cutter, the beam of energy scoring a black, sizzling line across the Titan's chest. The giant barely seemed to notice. It looked down at the wound, then back at Kael, and a slow, cruel smile spread across its face. It started toward him, its steps heavy and deliberate, each one a hammer blow of impending doom. This was a creature bred for one purpose: war. It felt no fear, only rage. It was stronger, tougher, and filled with a fury that had been kept on ice for generations. The silicates hadn't needed to conquer this sector. They had simply unlocked a cage and let the monster out. And now, that monster was coming for them. The Titan's smile was a terrifying thing, a crescent of cruel satisfaction on a face built for violence. It saw Kael not as a threat, but as a piece of meat, a final, satisfying crunch before it tore the rest of this sterile world apart. The plasma cutter in Kael's hand felt like a child's toy. The searing heat that had cauterized flesh and carved through titanium steel barely registered on the Titan's hyperdense hide. He was out of options, out of time, a ghost facing a god of rage. Kael, the coolant. Lena's voice was a sharp, cutting beam in the chaos. The main conduits under the central walkway. It's a closed geothermal loop. If you can rupture it, the pressure release will vent the entire reserve. Of course, the cryo bay wasn't just cold. It was actively, violently refrigerated by a massive, self-contained system. A weapon, hidden in plain sight. A flicker of hope, fierce and desperate, ignited in Kael's chest. He met the Titan's dead blue eyes and did the one thing it wouldn't expect. He turned and ran. The Titan roared, a sound of frustrated fury, and gave chase. Its steps were heavy, shaking the deck plates, but it was deceptively fast, its long legs covering the ground in huge, loping strides. Kael ducked and weaved through the forest of cryopods, his greater agility in the tight confines his only advantage. He risked a glance back. The Titan wasn't trying to navigate the aisles. It was simply plowing through them, smashing the pods aside with its massive shoulders, sending showers of shattered glass and frozen vapor into the air. It was a bulldozer of flesh and bone, and it was gaining. Yorick was stirring, shaking his head to clear the stars from his vision. He saw Lena frantically pointing toward a series of thick, heavily insulated pipes running beneath the grated floor of the main walkway. He saw Kael leading the monster on a desperate chase. Understanding dawned, and with a guttural roar of his own, he scrambled toward the target. "The primary regulator valve," Lena shouted, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "It's the weakest point. Break the seal." Kael risked a sharp turn, sliding on a patch of slick coolant, and brought the plasma cutter up, firing not at the Titan, but at the ceiling supports above it. A heavy lighting rig, thick with dust and old cables, groaned and tore free, crashing down. The Titan didn't even break stride, simply raising an arm to shield its head as the rig shattered across its back, then continuing its relentless pursuit. Yorick reached the walkway, tearing at the grate with his bare hands, his fingers screaming in protest as the metal bent and finally gave way. Below was a nexus of pipes, all converging on a single, massive valve housing marked with crimson warning labels. It was held in place by 6 thick, durasteel bolts. He had no tool, no lever, only his fists and his fury. Kael was running out of room. He was nearing the back wall of the cryo bay, a dead end. The Titan knew it. Its cruel smile returned as it slowed its pace, savoring the kill. It was toying with him now. Kael stood his ground, the plasma cutter held in a two-handed grip, his knuckles white. He had to buy Yorick one more moment. You were one of us, Kale yelled, his voice raw. They made you a monster to save them. Now you're going to kill their last hope. The Titan paused, its head cocked. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something other than rage crossed its face, a deep, ancient confusion, a ghost of memory. But it was fleeting. The rage returned, hotter than before, and it charged. Now, Jorik! Kale screamed. From beneath the walkway came a sound like a thunderclap. Jorik, with a final, desperate roar, had brought his fist down on the valve housing, not trying to turn it, but to shatter it. The last bolt sheared, and the seal on the primary coolant conduit ruptured. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. A pressurized blast of pure cryo fluid, colder than the vacuum of space, erupted from the floor. It wasn't a liquid, it was an explosive phase transition, a wave of absolute zero that flash froze everything it touched. The Titan, feet from KL, was caught in the heart of the blast. Its roar of triumph was cut short, turning into a choked, gargling cry of shock. Its skin, moments before impervious, turned white and brittle. The air around it crackled, filled with a sudden snowstorm of frozen atmospheric moisture. The giant raised its arms, a gesture of warding against an enemy it couldn't punch. And in that pose, it froze solid. The wave of cold washed over it, encasing it in a thick, opaque shell of ice. It stood there for a heartbeat, a statue of frozen rage before the sheer thermal shock caused its own hyperdense muscle mass to contract violently, and it shattered, crumbling into 1,000 pieces of frozen flesh and splintered bone that clattered across the ice-coated deck. Kale was thrown back by the force of the blast, shielded from the worst of the cold by the Titan's own body. He landed hard, even as the air driven from his lungs, his skin burning with frostbite, and the vent continued for a few more seconds, coating the entire chamber in a thick layer of white frost, before sputtering out, its reserves spent. Silence returned, absolute and profound. Jorik pulled himself from the maintenance trench, his hands and arms rimmed with ice, his face pale with exhaustion. Lena rushed to Kale's side, helping him to his feet. They stood together, the three of them, breathing heavily in the wreckage, surrounded by the frozen remains of a legend. Then, a soft sound drew their attention. It was Valerius. They had laid him down near the entrance, and he was stirring, his eyes open and clear. Kyle knelt beside him. The old man's chest was a ruin, his breathing a faint whisper, but the crystalline infection was gone, frozen and inert. "You did it," Valerius breathed, a faint, bloody smile touching his lips. "You fought a real Titan, and you won." He reached up, his trembling hand gripping Kale's arm with surprising strength. The first ones, they weren't just rage. They were a promise that when the darkness comes, we will always make monsters to fight it. His grip slackened, his eyes losing their focus. "You are the promise now, Kyle. Lead them." A final, shuddering breath escaped his lips, and he was still. Kyle gently closed the old man's eyes, a profound, aching sorrow settling over him. They had carried their past with them, and now they had to leave it behind. There was no time to mourn. A faint, familiar skittering sound echoed from the dark tunnel they had come from. The stalkers were coming. "Omega-12, Kale said, his voice hard as the frozen steel around them. He got to his feet, leaving the plasma cutter behind. It was a tool. He needed a weapon. He picked up a long, jagged shard of the shattered Titan's frozen femur. its weight solid and deadly in his hand. "Let's go!" They ran. They left the tomb of ice and heroes behind, plunging into the final set of tunnels. The sounds of the stalkers grew closer, a frantic, clicking pursuit. A new sound joined the chase. Bleeding through the bulkheads from ahead, the deafening roar of industrial machinery being pushed past its limits, the crackle of makeshift plasma arcs, and the deep, defiant shouts of their own kind. They burst through the final pressure door and into chaos. Omega-12 was not a command center. It was a fortress. The remnants had transformed the massive ore processing bay into a kill zone. Huge, mobile ore crushers had been positioned as barricades, their massive hydraulic jaws snapping at anything that came near. Conveyor belts ran backwards, dumping tons of jagged rock onto advancing chimes. High above, remnants with plasma casters, scavenged from the refinery, laid down withering fire. It was a symphony of brutal, industrial warfare. A woman with a face scarred by plasma burns and arms as thick as Kale's legs saw them emerge and barked in order. "Seal that door now!" Kale staggered forward, Yorick and Lena at his side. He was no longer just a worker from Gamma 9. He was a messenger from the dead, a leader forged in darkness and ice. He looked at the 50 or 60 faces around him, hard, grim, but unbroken, and saw not the dregs of the Republic, but its salvation. The low, resonant hum of the silicate hive mind still permeated the station, the heartbeat of their enemy. But here, in the deep, greasy heart of the forge, a new sound was rising to meet it, the clang of steel on crystal, the roar of repurposed machinery, and the defiant, united voices of the forgotten. The ghosts of Hephaestus Forge had risen, and their war had just begun.